All right, and we are live on Twitter and YouTube. So, welcome to another episode of Heartship, the now of leadership and us. I'm Mila Dishon and have my fabulous co-host Annalise Ponsky with me. I better point the right way because there you go.
Oh yeah, it's you.
How are you, Annalise?
Not too bad. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. It's sunny
Living?
today after a massive rain. My car got a free car wash, so that's good.
Yeah, it's cold and windy out here. It's like 37 in here in Chicago. So
Yeah. So yeah, Annalie is in Wisconsin and I am in Western Virginia, and we are doing this remotely and live. So we are live today on Twitter and on YouTube. Please use the hashtag Heartship as you see below with questions and comments. It'll be easier for us to find your comments as well. And we have a brilliant guest with us today. He walks the walk and is a practitioner of Heartship, where you lead from the heart through innovation, creativity, kindness, love, and in visionary ways. He is an education evangelist. So let's welcome our brilliant guest, Jaime Casap. Welcome, Jaime.
Thanks for having me. How's it going?
Good. I absolutely love the background. So it looks like a music video.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I work from home on a continuous basis anyway. So I just was preparing for a pandemic and didn't know it. So I have all the equipment to broadcast from home to be in my bunker, if you will, for the foreseeable future.
I like the word that you use, a bunker.
yeah, it feels that way.
Yeah. But no, but it's interesting, even though we are in our bunkers, people are doing creative things, right? Like I've seen an uptick of videos, and especially on TikTok. Like everyone has got a TikTok account now,
Right.
doing live shows. But I'm really curious to learn more about you. I mean, we've had a conversation, and I kind of like stalked you on LinkedIn because I absolutely love what you're doing.
Right.
And I know that you walk the walk. You're such an education evangelist. Tell us a little bit about yourself and how did you get into the education space?
Yeah. So I have been I've been at Google for the past 14 years and probably the last 10, the chief education evangelist. And it all started by accident. I got into the space because I was trying to solve a problem with Arizona State University, and they had an email issue. Long story short, we eventually launched what we used to call Google Apps for Education into the university space, and ASU was the first university to use these tools at the university. Fell in love with the space, got more into it, then got into this idea around launching Google Apps into K-12. We did that. And then a couple of years later, I had an idea of launching Chromebooks in education. So we've been part of the education space for a very long time. I've been in the education space on a global scale across the board. But what happened while I was going through this whole journey, I realized very early on that as we were talking about equity issues and as we were talking about technology issues and access issues and all these other issues around education, I realized that there weren't a lot of voices in this space that were like mine in the sense of my background, right? Because I am a first generation American. I was born and raised in Hell's Kitchen, New York, back in the 70s and 80s when it wasn't the greatest place to be. And education was the reason why I get to sit here and talk to you guys. So for me, education has been that ticket, if you will. Now, I can make one of two assumptions. I can assume that the reason I've been successful and been at Google for 14 years and Accenture for 7 years, and I have a college degree and a master's degree, I can assume all those things because I have a 500 IQ, and that's what my wife thinks I think. Or I can assume that there are millions of students just like me out there. And we need to understand why they're not successful. We need to understand why we don't have as many people like me in these positions of influence and power and those types of things. And so I think that luck plays a big part in all our lives. But what we need to do is eliminate luck as a requirement to success for students that are growing up in poverty and under not the best circumstances, to say it positive as I can. And so for me, being an education evangelist isn't about technology. It isn't about education policy. It's this idea that through education, you can accomplish anything. And through education, however we define that. And by the way, I think we're going through a phase right now where we're going to redefine what that looks like.
Mm-hmm.
Through education, you can accomplish anything, and never before in a time in history has education been so available. And so for me, that's where the evangelist role comes from. It's about bringing the good news of education, if you will.
I love that you touched on so many points, especially you mentioned about equity and access, right? So let's talk about that, because when we touch on equity, and it's often misunderstood and taken as equality, right? And equality does not equate to equity. And how does equity look like in the education space?
Right. So when it's important, that's a good point, to define the difference or tell the difference between equity and equality. Equality means everyone has access to the same stuff. Equity means that we need to recognize that some people aren't starting at the same point, and so they need more of a support structure in place to do that. So what we need to do as education isn't look at a room full of 30 students and say we need to treat them all the same, which we need to do. But what we need to do is understand that 10 of those kids are starting at a point where, let's say they're starting in kindergarten, where they can read, they can write, they can do X, Y, Z. They're great. And then you have 10 kids in that room who might are living under stressful conditions at home, might be abused, might have parents that don't have an education, might not be able to read. And understand that you can't just say the same book to those 20 students and say you all need to read at the same time. What you need to do is understand that 10 of those students are going to need more support, and they're going to need more help. And so it's finding the resources and the policies to focus on that equity part of it. And what do we do in that space? And that's I think the place that we need to spend a lot of time focusing on.
I love that you mentioned and highlighted this very important point. You mentioned about in a group of 30 students, right? 10 students might have stressful conditions at home, and this is something that we as leaders, this just does not happen in the United States. It happens at a global scale, right?
Right.
I remember going to school. I encountered the British education system, and I remember in primary school I was called the stupid child, right? Stupid student, because I would get 0 for maths. I get 0 for science. And that itself caused stress for me. And we fail to identify from the extended lens of how a child learns and what are the factors that there are so many variables that undergoes that impacts a child. I know, Annalie, you have been in the school system and you taught in Arkansas, right? So,
Yeah.
I mean, what have you seen to Jamie's point, the stressful conditions at home does affect students in how they learn?
Not that I want to make Jamie seem like he's wrong, but I think that I do agree with you. But in the sense is that, like, I think that sometimes you're saying like a third of the students be having like troubled backgrounds. And for some districts you have, in the district I worked in, 99% of my kids were living in poverty. So I think that we also need to look at like how it's community based. You're looking in a lot of schools that don't have access to like Wi-Fi, rural districts who are just getting access to these things, who have access to technology. And you're not just looking at the fact that you have kids. I had kids who had to take care of children. I had kids whose parents were on drugs. I had kids whose parents worked, 2 jobs, and they were the ones getting their food. And when you said that, you work to get Chromebooks in school, I even had like a kid steal a Chromebook because he needed diapers for his baby. So I think that I think we need to look beyond just like the school. Usually when you have places that have so much poverty, they're food deserts. So our kids don't have access to good food. There's a combination of like, you have more kids go having police contact. You have communities with high police contact. And what does that mean for kids and their relationship with authority? They're going to probably be have not much trust in authority figures, or feel like they're not really out to actually help them, that they're out to hurt them. You have places with chronic unemployment. What does that mean? That means probably higher instances of trauma. So you're going to you also have environmental inequality. You're going to have places where there've been maybe former factories. Maybe there's waste plants there, which impact the environment which kids live in. So it's not just the fact that there's education inequality. It's all of these inequalities working together to make it, I want to say, just not really a good situation for a lot of kids. And how do you overcome just not one instance of inequality? How do you overcome all of them? Because they work in tandem. They really do. And if you don't have access to food, how good is your education really going to be if you're only eating, hot chips? It's a really sad situation, because we really have to. And I mean, there's school districts where everyone is literally on state aid because there's just no money there.
Right. So I was using, just to be clear, I wasn't saying, I was using a statistical analysis, right? The third, not that any school is set up that way. It'd actually be great if a school was set up that way.
I just wanted to really kind of point out to listeners that it's not a third is not, you know what I mean? I don't want them to think that number is that number. Because there's districts where it's 100% of your kids are literally living. I want to show people it's dire in some places.
No, I live in downtown Phoenix, and they're mostly Title I schools here in downtown Phoenix. And actually, if you look at the statistics, more than half our students are living in the defined level of poverty, right? So that's more than half our students. So that if you take a school district, it's the entire school district. So then the equity issue because I was using a classroom example, but then it becomes the school example. If one school is in a poverty district and another school is in a rich district, then it becomes a state issue if one whole school district is in a bad issue or in a bad state and another one is in a good place, right? Then it becomes a federal issue if there's a whole region of school districts that have issues with poverty and issues that are going on there versus a region that's not. So it depends on where you take the equity lens to start looking at it, right? So you can look at it from the federal level, the state level, you can look at it from the district level, the school level, and even the classroom level, right? That's the point, is that equity is an issue across all those, and it depends on what level you look at it from, that it becomes a big problem or not, right? It depends on what you do. But I believe that, so we can look at this as a glass half full thing or a glass half empty thing. And for millions and millions of students, and by the way, I get to talk to thousands of students a year. So I'm in class, not only am I in classrooms, I'm right now, as a matter of fact, right after I get off of this podcast, I'm actually talking to 2 different classrooms today. It's because I sent out a request through a YouTube video on my YouTube channel for educators to say, hey, if you want me to come talk to students, I will just set it up and we'll do it. And I had a lot of requests for that. So I'm going in and talking to students. My point is that, I grew up under those circumstances. I grew up on welfare. I grew up on food stamps. I grew up with a single mother. I grew up with all those things. And when people ask me, how did I get out of that? I talk about why I was lucky to some degree, but at the same time, I understood what it took to be successful, what I needed to do. And education was one of those key elements. I guess what I'm getting at from a glass half full perspective is that in 1980, when I was 13 years old and ready to take on education, my education opportunities were, textbooks and the library. Today, we have an amazing opportunity to level the playing field, to bring equity through the resources that we have, because any student can learn lots of different things. Those other Maslow hierarchy factors need to be addressed.
Right.
But if you do address those, the ability to learn is tremendous. And so that's where I'm trying to focus, is how do we create opportunities for our students to really thrive in the environments that they're in, given the constraints and the circumstances that they face.
That's a very interesting point that you brought up, Jaime. Thrive in the circumstances and in the environments that they are in, right? And sometimes like you mentioned, there are so many situations, and equity, pertains to so many different environments, so many different variables as well. So, and it just seems like, approaching education as a whole, not just in the United States, but from a global perspective, right? Like in third world countries, to promote education. A lot of countries or in school systems, they do not have technology, and they depend on books, or they depend on this program where exchange program where you go teach in a different country, right? They depend on educators of that sort to come into their countries and to bring different kind of education to expand that knowledge, and it's not a gatekeeping knowledge, right? So that brings me to the next point from an education perspective. Like you have mentioned, leadership has a solo connotation. So how do we shift that perspective from a solo perspective to a collaborative mindset to beat those inequalities where equity is not present or access is not present?
Yeah, and that's a great point. And also an understanding here that these issues are across. I get to travel around the world, and the issues, whether they are on the bottom of the Maslow hierarchy of needs or on the top of the Maslow hierarchy of needs, the issues are the same no matter what are the conditions and what you're looking for. You find these conditions everywhere. You find them in more not exaggerated, that's not the right word, but in bigger ways. You're finding them in countries like in Africa, where when you go through Nairobi or you go through Tanzania and you see, you think, when I was there, I'm like, I thought I was poor, right? Like the conditions increase dramatically depending on where you are. But that being said, let's put that to the side and think about when you talk about leadership, what does leadership mean? How do you define leadership? And I think one of the issues when it comes to leadership is that it feels like this solo activity, right? It feels like this thing that you do on your own, when in reality, I think if we looked at it from a collaborative perspective, we might get more done. We might be able to focus on more things, right? Because I think part of the issue, and this is one of my theories, and I'm probably wrong, but one of my theories here is that education has always been set up as a single player sport, right? My 18-year-old was responsible for his grades, his assignments, his tests, everything was about him. He's accountable, he's responsible, and all those things are important, absolutely. But imagine my 18-year-old was sitting, in high school in a classroom, and they were taking a test, and at the end of the test, they went up to the front of the classroom to the teacher, and they said, "Hey, look, we were sitting back there, and we were doing this test, and I realized that there were some answers that I knew, and then I looked over at her paper, and I realized that there were some answers that she knew. So we decided to combine our skill set and work on this test together. Here you go." What would the reaction be to that, right? Like when you say that, and I do a lot of keynotes, and when you say something, tell a story like that in a room full of administrators, educators, they're like, "Oh my goodness, dude, that's cheating. I'd lose my mind." Why are we teaching students that finding people who are smarter than us is cheating, right? When that's all I do for a living is find people who are smarter than me. We need to focus on real collaboration, right? Which is the ability to change your mind, which is something that we desperately need right now. The ability to build consensus, right? So one of the things that Google looks for example, when they hire people is we look for leadership. That's one of the categories. But back to this idea of the definition of leadership, do you think we mean by leadership, can you tell people what to do and they follow you out of fear, right? Like, no, that's not what we're saying. What we're asking is, can you collaborate, right? Can you build consensus? Can you motivate? Can you influence? Can you let someone else drive, right? Like those are the real collaboration, the ability to change your mind, the ability to ask questions, the ability to have empathy, and the ability to take a step back and let someone else lead. Like, how do we take those factors of real collaboration and put them in our education model so that we're building collaboration, so that when they become future leaders, that's how they see leadership, not as something that I am as an individual responsible to, but as a team sport, which it should be, which is I work with other people to get things done. And I think you'd find more of this collaborative world as opposed to this single world that we find today.
I love that you mentioned the single wall, right? And that, whatever that you said, even like asking and collaborating is not cheating. That's so true. There's so many times in school systems. Well, I did not experience primary and secondary school in the United States, but in the British system, it's like everyone sits in the classroom is like single table. It's like rows. You can't look around. If you look around, it's like you're cheating. Why are you talking? Right? You can't discuss with your friends about, oh, what do you think about this question? And I would like, my teacher would take a ruler and hit my knuckle.
Right.
It's like, what the hell? How am I supposed to expand my thoughts? Right? And that's not collaboration. And you highlighted collaboration in the means of asking questions, having empathy, just collaborating. And I watched this movie, Mark Zuckerberg. I didn't even watch the movie for 10 over years, and I accidentally bumped into it on Netflix. And in one part of the movie, he talks about how for his art class, he put up the art image onto Facebook and just asked his friends, what do you think about this? And he was highlighted. He was like highlighted as cheating. Teachers thought that he was cheating. But that's not cheating, right? Collaboration comes in the form of asking, collaborating ideas and not stealing ideas, right? So I want to dig a little bit deeper into how can empathy pan out as leaders, in the education system? Like, how does it look like? How can leaders really, truly embody empathy and not just like have a cheat sheet, right? And say, okay, this is what I'm going to do in the workplace. And then when I go home, I'm just going to crumble it up and throw it in the rubbish bin. So what does empathy really look like?
Yeah, empathy is one of those interesting words for me because we talk about it a lot, or we try to define it. And the reality is, I think empathy is like anything else that you're born with. I think some people are born with lots of empathy and some people are born with little empathy. And sometimes you can work on it one way or the other, but so I have 3 kids, right? I have a 27-year-old, an 18-year-old, and a 5-year-old, right? And yeah, so I only like one kid at a time, right? So I like one at a time, and now they're all home and they're driving me insane. So when I look at the 3 and I reflect back at them growing up, I think about my 27-year-old when she was 5. And her empathy level was interesting. She was very competitive. She would, knock you in the head with a baseball bat and you'd like fall over and she'd be like, come on, you're fine, get up, right? Like she was that kid. And then this 5-year-old, my third 5-year-old, this is a true story. The other day we were reading one of those like cartoon books about planets, and towards the end of the book, it's these drawings of the solar system, and Pluto is outside the solar system, and it's a little cartoon picture of a planet with a sad face. And my 5-year-old starts bawling because she's sad that Pluto's not included in the solar system, that she's sad for the planet Pluto, like it's got feelings, right? So that's her level. And we, my wife and I talk about this all the time. She's got an insane level of empathy, right? So I think you're born with a certain level of it. How do we assess? How do we assess empathy, right? How do we know what level of empathy we have? And then the second question for me that I'm curious about is, can you improve on your empathy, and how, right? How do we take my older 5-year-old, my 27-year-old when she was 5, and say, no, you just don't, you got to worry about what they feel like, or whatever. What are those things that you can do to work on empathy? Because I don't think that empathy is like anything else, right? Is a skill that is the same across the board. I think you're born with a different level of empathy depending on who you are. And yeah, we can talk about environmental factors and we can talk about family factors, but in my case, same kids, same family, different levels of empathy depending on who they are, what their personality makeup is.
I think when you're kind of talking about education, Mila, I think if you ask like a lot of teachers like what they would probably change, and keeping in mind like the teachers that I've worked with and the teacher I've been, is just what is the purpose of education? I think that a lot of times that we get kind of lost in like what is our actual purpose here, because whenever you go to like any part of the year, there's testing where it's just like you need to have your data in. I know that when I worked, every 2 weeks I needed data into the state because the state comes in. Every quarter you have like your prep for ACT testing. Then every year you have your like state standardized testing. So I think you lose your empathy when you reduce people to numbers. And I think that you can see that all across the board, like beyond education. Think about when you do I think about other people when they do like their yearly reviews, it's like you're quantified. Mm-hmm. So is there a lot of empathy when we're quantifying people? Are we looking at like those qualitative characteristics? So I think it's just, how do we view people? How do we view our purpose? I think that's like the big is just, what is the purpose here? And I think you lose your empathy when you just see people as like modes of production rather than like actual human beings.
That's really interesting that you mentioned about, empathy is being reduced when you start seeing them as data, as numbers, right? And this translates really well. This modality translates into the workspace, into communities, into religious practices as well. Whatever that is happening in the education space transfers, because those students, those children are taking in, they are absorbing whatever is being taught to them or happening in the environment, and that kind of like translates. So this like makes me ask the following question. So should we be introducing empathy in the education space? Just like, when you graduate out of school, you do not know how to do your taxes.
No.
Right? I didn't know how to do my taxes. That was not a thought. So, and the same thing, right? When you go into the workforce, like learning about different personalities and being kind and understanding that kindness is not weakness, right? But empathy goes a long way, and that's the kind of leaders that we want. So are we missing that huge gap in education spaces where we are not teaching or not speaking or introducing about what empathy is? What is it like to treat other people or to value other people? How does this fall into the education space?
Yeah, so I think it's a balancing act between looking at data and looking at information and looking at people as individuals. Look what we're going through right now. I've been on calls all morning so far since 7:00 this morning, so I don't know what the latest numbers are, but I'm making up a number, right? Let's say 10,000 Americans have died from COVID-19. I don't know what the actual number is, but let's just use that as an example. That's a number, right? 10,000. And you're like, wow, that's a big number. But if you start trying to dive deeper into that number and you realize the number of people affected, and it can get overwhelming. If you start saying, hey, we're not going to look at it as a big number, we're going to look at it as individuals, you get 4 people in before you just lose it, right? Because of all the impacts that it has and all the things. So it's this balancing act between looking at big numbers and looking at big data, and then at the same time, trying to be empathetic about what that data actually means. And so I think it's important to find what that balance is. But more importantly for me is getting to the root cause of things and questions. So you mentioned, standardized testing and prep tests and all these other things that people work on. I want to know what are we focused on, right? To your point, like this whole thing around testing and this whole thing about assessments isn't about students at all. It's about adults. And so if you look at education as, back to your question about what's the purpose of education, and the purpose of education for me is to prepare students for their life, then the testing part all of a sudden doesn't become that important. As a matter of fact, all the data, all the research shows you that testing doesn't do anything, right? The idea that it done the wrong way. So quizzes work like doing something, like learning something, and then experiencing it and failing at that experience, which is in its own way a test that works, right? But taking a test, like memorizing 3 chapters and then memorizing all the key phrases and words and facts and figures, and then taking a test and then getting those results back 3 months from now, that doesn't work. we're not paying attention to, talk about real data. We have data. There's no mystery here. That does not work. And yet we continue to do it. Why? Because it's not about the students. It's about the adults. It's about, to your point of, we need that data for pay performance. We need that data to fund schools. We need that. It's where is the student in all of that? So I think that even before trying to figure out how do you take big data numbers and create empathy around it, like, let's ask a bigger question, which is, why do we have those things at all? When if we focus on our students, the question we should be asking ourselves, especially through what we're going through now, is what are the most essential things that we can focus on in education for our students, period.
That's such a powerful thing that you said, focus on students. And that's so true, right? And to a point, we are living in a data-driven world, right? Just to get funding. And you need to prove everything. If not, you do not get funding. Departments in universities get shut down, right? Like diversity department gets shut down, multicultural departments get shut down, as saying that, oh, that's not important. But when you treat all this thing as isolated departments or isolated teams or isolated variables, then we will never have a cohesive, a collaborative environment, right? And this brings me to the next question. Collaboration, right? We want to work in the collaborative space, and empathy pulls in collaboration, education pulls in collaboration. Now, does collaboration promote groupthink, though? When we want to collaborate, and this happens in the workspaces, right? And even in group discussions in universities and school spaces, where when you get together in a group, everyone's like, oh, let's collaborate. And then one dominant voice says something and everyone kind of like agrees with that person. So does it promote groupthink? How can we break group thinking whilst collaboration is happening?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think it leads us to discuss or to question, how do we define collaboration, right? How do we define these elements? Because in education, one of the things that I talk about is, when I talk about collaboration, I make sure I'm clear, and I think this is the perfect time to do this as well, which is, I'm not talking about groupthink, right? I'm not talking about projects, right? And what I mean by that is, the current model for collaboration is, you take one paper that one student can do, but now you assign it to 4 students. And 4 students have to work on that paper, and 3 of them pay that one student to actually write the paper, and that person writes it. That's an environment for groupthink. That's an environment to get one voice be the dominant voice. Let's say they all wanted to participate. The dominant person is going to drive that assignment and the content for that paper. That leads to groupthink. Real collaboration is when you have a certain skill that you're bringing to the table that only you can do. And when you have that kind of environment, then you can't have groupthink, because it's your skill. So for example, and I hate to use sports as an analogy, but if you think about a basketball team, and man, this week the NBA playoffs are supposed to start, and I've never missed sports more than I'm missing them right now. I love the NBA. Okay, I'll get off on that rant for a second. But
are you a Knicks fan?
Do I have to admit that publicly? Yeah. Unfortunately, yes, I am. But I live here in Phoenix, so I follow the Suns too. But I'm just a basketball fan, right? But if you think about a sports team, you got a point guard, you got an off guard, you got a center, or the traditional model, right? It doesn't exist. But you have everyone playing a role, and they play that role. You can't have groupthink. You can't have all of them rebound at the same time. You can't have all of them shoot at the same time. They all have to play a role. So in the world of work, if you can create the teams that you build matter, right? Are you putting in a groupthink work, or are you putting in specific skills and roles that people can play? Because if you do that, you're not going to get groupthink, because everyone's playing a specific role, and that's their expertise, or that's their area, and they're bringing that perspective to the table. So it all comes down to how you set it up.
I love that. I love that you use the sports analogy as well, because Annalie is a huge sports fan.
Not everyone is, but sports works so well in so many different situations, right?
It's like the ultimate collaboration. And I think that that's what I think just about myself. I played sports since I was a little kid. And it was like, once you really learn that like each person, you know, maybe there are people who aren't as strong as like other people, but you realize that they still contribute, that they have to. And I feel bad for a lot of kids haven't really experienced sports in like that sense, having like a, you know, a good environment, because it really does teach you how to be a team and how to find strengths in people, like regardless, because you need them.
By the way, and people talk about sports and kids needing to play sports. I think it's anything that creates that model. So for example, playing online video games does the same thing as far as I'm concerned, right? Like, you know, we look at video games as this negative thing. My generation, old people like me, look at like, oh, these kids are playing video games, because of our perspective about video games is Pac-Man, right? And when you actually think about Pac-Man, Pac-Man is the biggest waste of time in your life. Now, I believe that I haven't never been in a car accident, knock on wood, because of Pac-Man, because my reaction skills are so fast. But in an overall like development, there's not a lot there. You're just going around in circles and doing the whole thing.
You're just eating.
My 18-year-old is developing collaborative skills. He's playing roles. More like just like sports. One of the greatest things about sports is just-in-time feedback, right? Like, you know, you miss a rebound and the point guard, like a Steve, I got one of the blessings for me from a sports perspective is I got to watch years and years of Steve Nash play basketball, right? And I would go to games and just like a camera focus on him through the entire game. I watch entire games. I was a point guard just focusing on Steve Nash. And like he would go up and just whisper something in someone's ear, like talk about just-in-time assessments, talk about just-in-time feedback, and more importantly, talk about like, that's done. Now let's move on to the next thing, right? Like you can't do anything about that. You screwed that up. Now let's learn from that. And then let's do it better the next time. And that kind of environment also exists in the esports world, for example, right? So this idea of the skills that you're developing and building through that can be done in lots of different ways if the conditions are the same or pretty close.
I love that you mentioned about games, because I used to play World of Warcraft. It's
I'm just impressed that you admit that publicly. That's cool.
No, I used to play World of Warcraft, and it is such a collaborative game, right? And I used to have a guild, and I used to be the guild master, and that translates really well into identifying. You need to identify every person, your team members' skills, right? Everyone would play either a mage or a hunter or a paladin. These are all the characters in the game.
Right.
But still, even if someone plays a mage or a hunter, the way that they skill up, like you can play a mage, you can play either a fire mage or arcane mage or a ice mage, right? And the skills that they distribute strengthens or brings certain types of skills to the game. So it was really important for me as a guild master to identify, okay, you are a mage. What kind of mage are you? What kind of strengths are you going to come and play? And we would go into dungeons. Dungeons is more like a quest where you have the end boss, where you have to kill the boss. So when we go into the dungeon, you can't like just charge everyone at one time. You need to have the warrior go in charge first.
Sure.
You know, like get the monster's attention, and then the fire mage or the arcane mage. And sometimes the fire mage can't do damages during a certain time in the game because that monster will be immune. So gaming, sports, everything highlights a very important perspective into collaboration.
Well, I was going to say this theme that we're developing here is this idea around, you know, the single player versus the collaborative team-based thing. But also, it doesn't mean that a collaborative world does not mean leadership goes away. Actually, it means the opposite, right? And so, for example, in sports is a great way to highlight this, right? When, you know, think about football and an offensive football team and how everyone has to play their role perfectly, but there's still a leader, right? Tom Brady, I'm a Giants fan, so I like the Patriots because the Giants always beat them in the Super Bowl. That's just going to get a lot of bad comments. But Tom Tom Brady, at the end of the game, when they lose, he's like, that's on me. No, it's not. It's not on him, right? But he's the leader. He's responsible, but he could never do his job unless they were in a collaborative environment. But he still takes the accountability and the responsibility, even though it's not him. So it's a great way to show. Same thing with Steve Nash, who I've seen tons of his interviews after games when they lost. Like, yeah, that one's on me. I missed the play. No, it was, it's everyone. But that's a great example of you can have both. You can have a collaborative environment and have that individual accountability leadership, that you can have both at the same time. And sports is a great way to show that that's possible.
Yeah, because you made me kind of think, because I'm a big hockey fan, and I noticed that you guys have the Coyotes out there, which have some of my old players from the Blackhawks. And what I think is really interesting, too, is that leadership doesn't always have to remain stagnant in, like, who the leader is. Because I think about so many times when, like, they'll talk about, like, the Blackhawks, they'll talk about how, okay, so this game was particularly bad for, like, defensemen. So, like, Brent Seabrook will pipe up and, essentially say whatever needs to be said. Guys. Right. And then you might look at the next game. Okay, so the goaltender is saying something. I think it's also knowing that we can be leaders at different times, that there can be, like, we each have it in us. So can we be a soft leader? Can we be very, very intense leaders? And I think it's just, we can have situational leadership. And I think that's really important for people to remember too, that you don't always have to be the leader all the time, or that you don't always have to be quiet in the room, that, your voice is heard, and it's important too.
Yeah. And that's the whole point, right? Is that you can have both at the same time. And back to the idea of real collaboration and leadership is the ability to know how to take a step back and let someone else lead.
I love that point that you said, that leadership is about collaboration and knowing when to step back and let someone else lead, right? And that includes empathy and kindness and self-awareness as well, to lead effectively from the heart. And I know that we're running out of time, and Jaime, I would like to hear your thoughts. You've been in the education space for 14 years.
Yeah.
And I see you like.
I know you warned me about the final part of this, and so I'm starting to prepare for that. Come here, Azella, come here. Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry. Ask me that last question.
No. So this is like, and that's what we like our guests to be as natural as possible, to show their true side. So this is so fitting.
Right.
So, hello. Hi. What's your name?
What's your name?
Azella.
Ooh, what a cool name.
Like, it sounds like a warrior. I love it. So,
yeah.
Coming back to like the education space, what thoughts, what kind of positive thoughts do you have to say to students, especially in the education space, and to educators about leadership? And anyone can step forward. Like, what kind of thoughts can you give to enable students?
Yeah. So sit here for a second so I can answer this question. I think, look, I'm a huge fan of educators, and I'll tell you this: I've worked in education, I worked in technology, I've worked in electronics and high tech. I was at Accenture, so I worked for a project with United Health Groups. I worked in healthcare. Before joining Accenture, I worked for Governor Cuomo, the first Governor Cuomo. So I worked in government, and I can tell you that without any hesitation, that the most not only important, but the most passionate and dedicated workforce out of any workforce are teachers, are educators. You can make an educator cry in 30 seconds, right? You cannot make a hedge fund manager cry in 30 seconds. It's just not possible. And that passion and that dedication needs to be utilized. We need to think of, so when I talk in education, I talk about taking advantage of that, of like, you got them, they're bought in. Right? They're in. So how do we turn them loose? How do we give them the autonomy that they need to create the best environments for our students, instead of always pushing down to them, you need to do this standard and you need to do this, or we can't trust you to do this. And I think this environment here that we're going through, we got to start looking for the blessings in all this. And I think one of them is this idea that leaders in education be like, oh, look, these teachers are doing this from home. They're doing it on their own. We're not controlling them. They're creating these environments. Our students are doing X, Y, Z. So I think you'll start seeing potentially, hopefully, again, glass half full kind of guy, some of these things come out of this, which is that educators have that opportunity to do that. And the last thing I talk to educators about, and I do this with them as well, which is, who is your 4th grade teacher? They'll tell you in an instant, right? Like, who is your 9th grade teacher? They'll tell you in an instant. Like, and then you ask a person in the business world, who is your first manager at that job that you had working in a grocery store? And I'm like, I have no idea, right? Like, that's the impact that educators have, right? Like, that you remember who your 4th grade teacher is, right? Like, that's huge impact. Like as an educator, whether your students like it or not, they're going to remember you for the rest of their life. Right? And that's a huge responsibility to take on. So if you take those two factors, where we can give leaders an opportunity to show, to give teachers the tools and the resources that they need to thrive, and then we can turn them on, we can turn educators on to our students, then we can get I think we can get some amazing results from that.
Beautiful. That's really beautiful. Thank you for sharing your brilliant insight, your expertise, your heart set, and your mindset on Heartship. And it was great meeting your daughter as well on live.
Yeah, what happened to the dance element to this?
Oh, now the dance is coming on. So are you all ready to boogie?
You ready to dance?
A little.
A little.
So folks, every podcast we end with a dance, and we try to, a lot of our guests are embarrassed by it, but
Get off here.
so let me pull up the music.
Okay.
And show us your best moves.
All right.
Or your
Yeah.
Okay, let me increase the volume, and then where's the sound?
These are my dance moves.
Okay, are we ready?
Hey, so you back? I'm a savage.
Hey, Azella, come help me.
Bougie, ratchet, sassy,
All right.
hacking, stupid. What's happening?
Okay, she doesn't want to do it. She's more embarrassed than I am.
Ratchet, sassy.
All right. That's all you got from me.
Thank you for being
Got more than the finger.
great.
Thank you guys for having me.
Thank you
very
coming,
much.
Jaime. It was such a pleasure having you.